This is Business Edge on News Central. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Our headline story: 2020, the year of African startups. The startup ecosystem in Africa has grown beyond leaps and bounds to exceed expectations. The resulting funding achievement of these new ventures has become proof of the successes being recorded. A cross-section of this is our focus today. We'll also touch base with a few stories we're keeping our eyes on with NC4 to watch before we wrap the show. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now, 2020 came with its promises, and then the reality of COVID-19 shattered many of those promises. Many industries, sectors, and even economies came crashing to their knees. Despite all of this, the African startup ecosystem remained resilient and thrived. The growth of technology-based entrepreneurs has continued to break ground across the continent. In Egypt, e-health startup Vizeta raised a $40 million Series D funding round in February 2020. PayMob is an infrastructure technology enabler providing payment solutions to empower digital financial service providers through mobile wallet technology. In Eastern Africa, Market Force is Kenya's retail tech startup that was launched in 2018, and it had a huge year in 2020. In December, the startup introduced a new business-to-business or B2B e-commerce marketplace with plans to scale it up to new locations in 2021 and add new services to its offerings. Also in Kenya, AmiTruck launched its peer-to-peer or P2P trucking logistics marketplace in 2019, intent upon disrupting the country's difficult and inefficient road transportation network by connecting transporters directly with cargo owners, skipping middlemen, and making pricing more competitive. In Southern Africa, a notable startup worth mentioning uses technology to manage properties. Rios finally launched its services to the public towards the end of 2020 with backing from heavyweight local angels, including Bill Palladino and Mark Forrester. Premier Credit is a micro-lending platform in Zambia. It started operations in 2019 and provides microloans to Zambian entrepreneurs and small-scale traders, primarily women, and has already launched operations in Zimbabwe in partnership with a local bank, providing affordable bicycles, smartphones, and solar equipment on a pay-as-you-go basis. Now coming to West Africa, Togolese startup Gozem was initially a motorbike riding hailing service, but quickly added car taxis, rickshaw hailing, expanded to Benin Republic, and launched an e-commerce delivery services. And finally acquired Togo's leading food delivery app, Deliverom, in October. The acquisition of fintech company Paystack by global payment lender Stripe for more than $200 million was a landmark moment for the African startup scene. When the COVID-19 crisis hit, many expected the African startup space to dwindle. Funding in particular was expected to take a serious hit, and there were fears for the survival of many of the continent's most exciting young businesses. Some startups were seriously impacted, but African tech has managed to ride out the crisis, though it isn't over yet. Joining me is an investor and startup founder, Gulbet Kiros. He is the CEO and founder of Faya Media. Gulbet, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get straight into it. We're seeing Silicon Valley, their investors, and even indigenous counterparts getting into the tech startup space and looking for where to put a lot of the money they have. So tell me, what are investors looking for when they decide on what firms to invest in?
I think first and foremost is the viability of the business and ability to scale. And a close second is obviously founders. And a huge driver in the recent uptick in funding is actually the pre-seed seed investment ticket size, or the size of that investment early on has significantly increased. So before pre-seed, you might see somewhere between 150,000 to 250,000. Now pre-seed could be $1 million. Seed, most guys, are lucky if they get about $1 million, $2 million. Now that has become the norm, and a huge byproduct of that is the quality of the teams behind the companies. So if you look at the most recent data that was published, which you obviously referenced earlier, there are a lot of second, third time founders in these companies. That gives investors a lot of confidence that these candidates are more than capable to understand the market, have a track record of managing resources. So that has been a huge driver. And outside of that, also, the fundamentals, I think, for the continent is still strong. I know we went through, an exogenous shock with COVID. Then we had a bit of an internal crisis with SARS. But these things are more of a temporary glitch. But the fundamental of a fast rising middle class, growing population, young demographic, all of those, is still true. And we still have a lot of problems. And if we figure out a way to solve them and find, a way to get paid in the process, makes it, very attractive for investors.
All right, so before we go further, you mentioned pre-seed and seed. For someone who's not in this space, it makes it sound like you're talking about farming, and that's not what we're talking about. So just a quick explanation, pre-seed, seed, take us through the various
And you can actually equate it to farming. Okay. Pre-seed is essentially like somebody supporting you to acquire or even, say clear the land. Prepare, yeah. So at that stage, you really have an idea. At that stage, basically, there's, you might have like an early iteration of the product, but nothing that's ready to go to market. Seed, you essentially have finished your MVP and maybe have one or two people, using your product. So you've shown essentially a little bit of traction.
Okay.
So that's seed. Then you can equate it to actually buying, somebody helping you clear the land, even buy some tools to help you actually plant.
Okay, so let's look at some of the startups across regions. Now, since it launched in 2015 in Cairo, Vizeta has allowed more than 4 million patients across 4 countries to search, book, and review the best doctors and medical services in just 1 minute. It also provides innovative software as a service to more than 30,000 healthcare providers listed on its platform. In May, Market Force raised $350,000 in seed funding. It was then named as the only sub-Saharan African company selected for the Y Combinator Summer 2020 batch, securing another $150,000 in funding. Now in August, Paymob raised $3.5 million funding round to grow its merchant network and accelerate regional expansion, with a startup targeting further expansion in Africa and the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. In December of 2020, Premier Credit secured $650,000 in funding from Enigma Ventures to support further expansion across the SADC region. Now, I'm coming back to you, Gulbet. Which of these regions do you think will lead in terms of digital innovative solutions? We're seeing so many different things happening from east to south to west to north as well, but sometimes you always have a front runner. You have the horse that gets out of the gate first, and even the one that crosses the line first at the end of the day. Do you see any region particularly sort of taking dominance when it comes to how startups are growing and incubated in that space?
If you look at the data, obviously, South Africa, I think, had the biggest resources allocated to it. But in terms of number of companies, West Africa and Nigeria, and a huge part of that is also demographic. Any product you launch and does well, say in Nigeria, you have 200 million people to either provide, product or service. This question is rather tricky also on a personal reason. Obviously, I'm from Ethiopia, so living in Nigeria. So I feel like I've already voted on, which region I think will do well. But I tend not to focus on regional things. I think you have to kind of look at the individual companies. I think at the end of the day, execution is what will drive.
But isn't execution sometimes based on some external factors that could be regulation, could be, again, as we talked about access to market, this huge population, this demographic that's waiting, those are some of the factors outside of what an individual company can sort of control?
Well, so you're absolutely right. To kind of even answer that, you kind of have to assume all things being equal, which fundamentally, they're not. And the best way to look at it is, when I say still depends on the individual companies, right? you mentioned the Togolese company, right? If you look at the demographic at Togo, it's, you can launch a similar service in one of the 36 states and probably exceed
the number for the overall country.
Exactly. And same thing, like if you capture Lagos, you've already exceeded what you can potentially extract out of Ghana, right? Lagos is the 5th largest economy in Africa by itself. So whichever founder is able to navigate that better, at the end of the day, all of these, external factors are obviously part of the pedigree of the team you're betting on in a way. So as an investor, I kind of have 3 things I look at. I call them my 3 M's, and the first and foremost is the management, right? If you have a solid management, they will know how to, even if the product doesn't do well, they know how to quickly react, kind of be on top of it, and also engage stakeholders, right? So talk to their investors, their board, get a lot of support. There's a certain maturity that comes with that. The second is the market. It's like conquering, you can be a king in a small pond, or you can be a shark in a big ocean. And that, to be the shark in the big ocean also, it's not easy, right? So that comparison in a lot of ways isn't a good way to look at it. I think there's a lot of excitement, say, in North Africa, because they're not a traditional, hotbed for VC. My last venture, we actually built a product and we're funded by a company out of GCC. And we're a payment infrastructure company. And we're able to roll out there faster than here. Just, in terms of regulations being clear, things are a bit more streamlined. But, if you look at that whole market, what you can potentially extract or
what you
build
can extract
value.
in the troublesome markets.
It's a challenge.
Okay, it's a challenge I think many startups across the continent are probably very much taking on. Let's talk a bit about mergers and acquisitions now. We see those happening, as well as expansions into other locations by African startups. And I think you've touched on this just a bit now. What makes a region attractive to a startup from another region? We've talked about the population in terms of the demographic. We talked about the problems being solved as well. Regulation. Is there anything you want to add to that very quickly?
Again, the customer base, if you look at the Paystack Stripe deal, right? A company like Stripe doesn't need to compete now. Like Paystack had established itself, acquired a lot of customers. At that point,
they just transfer those customers to Stripe.
Exactly. There's those types of mergers that are complementary, right? So instead of coming to a new market, you can essentially acquire that,
the market leader there.
Exactly. Or, it's a good entryway. And two, again, I think people tend to forget a business is really made up of people, right? So if these people have figured it out, you might as well, kind of double down on the people that know this market and ensure you have faster growth and success with them. We don't really have a good track record of merger and acquisitions outside of the banks, and usually even in our market, when banks are merging, it's never usually for a good reason, right?
It's not always seamless.
Yeah, it's like a forced marriage, usually demanded by CBN.
With a shotgun.
Yeah, and a huge part of that is, in our ecosystem, the investor base tends to not see every transaction in purely commercial terms. Like selling an entity might, they kind of see it as, selling some sort of family legacy, something like that, as opposed to you're a shareholder, you have a better offer, and this is
the next step for the business.
Absolutely.
Okay, on this note, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk more about investors. African investors seem to now be waking up to the African startup ecosystem. Are they investing? Will this bubble bust? And of course, we'll talk about more issues in this particular conversation. Stay with us. Thank you so much for staying with us. I still have the CEO and founder of Faya Media with me, and we're talking about the African startup ecosystem. 2020 was a fantastic year for startups across the continent. So Gilbert, let's go back to it. Now, we had many startups across the continent getting funding, from fintech to e-commerce and even ed tech, which we still need to see a lot more development from. But in your opinion, Which of these seems to attract the most funding? Is it because of where the problem is sort of the biggest, the issue is the deepest, or there are more people for that startup to have access to and address that problem? What really gets the most funding when it comes to the products and the startups coming to the market?
I mean, Nigeria historically has been fintech. And personally, I don't think, fintech will yield the alpha or, the above market returns most investors are hoping for, just because.
Why not?
It's crowded, right? If you look at it from an investor's perspective, like at a certain point, you're just, if you see it as war, right? You're just giving bullets to everybody, as opposed to, kind of seeing consolidation in that space.
And now we see Nigerian banks trying to enter it as well.
Yeah, and the problem also we have with that is, instead of seeing the banks, or the banks seeing these guys as partners, right? The banks tend to see everybody as a threat. So, and I think we talked about it last time I was here. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. There's other things. I think earlier we were talking about. It's good to have like a focused partner. Say, if you have a technology focused team, that's their job day in, day out. You as a bank, your core function is essentially lending, managing credit, right, facilitating transactions. In terms of the value you can extract by building your own fintech, it's almost like launching a new company within a company, and it makes it less likely other banks will use your platform, right? So if GT launches a product, it's highly unlikely Zenith will, kind of use that product because nobody wants to support their competitor.
Okay, competitor, true.
In terms of ed tech, I think, so my own theory on that space, the educational space, is till you actually create the jobs, right? The branding also for the quality of education with online, and people are able to see, oh, if I take this course or I do this,
this is the outcome, the outcome.
Yeah, I don't, the sake of going to school for the sake of going to school also has unintended consequences, right? It sets a lot of expectation for the youth. Like we have, a lot of university graduates. The quality of that
is different than the number of them.
Exactly, and and I say that as somebody, been here for a long time, employed a lot of youth, fresh grads. There's almost like a lot of cost on, on our entities to train them to be able to function in a corporate setting. So in terms of, fine tuning that space itself,
it'll take more time.
Yeah, but there are a lot of great companies. ULesson is one. There's another fully, virtual campus, Benin American University, is actually affiliated with a few other universities in the States. So I like it. I just don't think a lot of people jump on it till they see some sort of transition into paying jobs. So
e-commerce still gets it. So we've talked about fintech being the big money spinner in Nigeria. What about in East Africa? What about in South Africa? What are we looking at?
I think by the time you go to Kenya, they tend to be a bit more diverse. A lot of logistics
businesses
have done, especially in Kenya, have raised pretty decent money. South Africa, it's a lot more diverse, and that also goes to show in terms of the maturity of that market. So when you go from TMT to fintech to insurance tech, there are a couple of exciting companies I was looking at South Africa around insurance. To bring them here, there's no reason why we wouldn't be able to launch them, but obviously it goes back to some of that external factor of you kind of, before you solve a problem, you tend to know, there's a requirement for you to kind of know the space well, so you can identify what the pain points are and develop a solution. But there are one or two insurance tech companies in Nigeria as well as healthcare.
Okay. Yeah, it's coming up. And at the end of the day, conversation is the fact that they are growing. There might be some right now that are the superstars of the ecosystem, but there are definitely those who are nipping at their tailcoat. So let's talk about funding now. We've seen that external funding on many fronts might be dwindling, but with startups, there are clearly a number of African investors who are becoming more interested and are actively investing. Many would even say it's past time for Africans to invest in Africa. So what do you think about this trend? You're smiling and I haven't even finished the question. Why does it seem like it's taken so long, or has it? Maybe it's because I'm looking at it from the outside. Has it taken so much time to see African investors invest in the African startup ecosystem? And maybe why is it happening now?
Yeah, again, I think might have discussed this last time, but I'll harp on it again. I think we need like a vibrant intermediaries, right? So
who can point them in the direction of how to spend their money?
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's what, VCs essentially, like even the ones, we call them outside investors, they also have their own fundraising team, right? So they're called LPs or limited partners. They're the guys that usually fund, the fund managers. They manage the money. Locally, we need essentially a decent amount of, and we have about 3 or 4 that have done well, but to be able to sustain that, we also need the local money to kind of invest smart. A huge driver of LPs outside our market is insurance companies, pension companies, and as part of their diversification of their portfolio, they put a little bit in VCs, PEs, infrastructure.
Oh, wow.
If you look at the Nigerian pension, there's a massive balance sheet. Most of it goes to, essentially just goes to buy government bonds. Of course it's safe, but it doesn't actually
sometimes grow that portfolio.
It's actually negative return when you adjust for inflation. And for us, and we've tried to work very hard with some pension and insurance companies. They're also under a lot of pressure, and nobody wants to venture into something
that they're not sure about, and the returns are questionable.
Yeah.
All right, Gilbert, we'll pause the conversation here because I think there's a lot more in terms of the African startup, but we are very happy to see the progress of the startups on the continent in 2020. The pandemic year, as we call it, but a year in which we saw success, we saw scale, we saw funding for many of these startups. I would say a very big thank you to my guest. He is the founder and CEO of Faya Media, Gulbet Kiros. Definitely going to have him back. This is not the first, this is the second. If you've missed our very first conversation, you can check it out on our YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube and search News Central TV and you'll find it there. So let's wrap things up with NC4 to watch as we usually do. The Kenyan government plans to exempt startups. Again, startups are in the conversation, operating in the country from the 1.5% digital tax following outcry from local entrepreneurs. The state is considering amendments to the Finance Act 2020, which would lift the burden from young local businesses that use digital marketplaces to derive income. The African Export-Import Bank has mobilized $1 billion for an adjustment facility to offset revenue losses for countries that lower cross-border tariffs as part of an Africa-wide free trade area. And this is according to the zone's most senior official. The world's biggest free trade area was implemented on January the 1st, and it aims to bolster intra-African trade by lowering or eliminating cross-border tariffs on 90% of goods, facilitating the movement of capital and people, promoting investment, and paving the way for a continent-wide customs union. Third on our list, South African taxpayers should brace for the announcement of further tax hikes in Finance Minister Tito Mbowene's February budget speech as the government grapples with the growing debt burden and revenue losses from the COVID-19 pandemic. The National Treasury has said that it plans to raise 40 billion rand through additional taxes over the next 4 financial years. And finally, Morocco's Ministry of Finance has announced a budget deficit of 82.4 billion Moroccan dirham by the end of December 2020. The deficit amounts to 7.6% of the country's GDP. The ministry disclosed these figures in its report on the Treasury's expenses and resources. Budget deficit refers to the difference between the country's overall public spending and revenue when the former exceeds the latter. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge. Follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. Head to our website, www.newscentral.africa, and download our mobile app on Play Store and Apple iOS Store. Until next time, I'm Tolu Lokwe at Dilleru Baluni.